yes, I still do stuff with Dudleyas yet. Okay, but we're talking about oaks tonight, and just as sort of a read in, I wasn't always someone interested in oaks. I was at UC Santa Barbara, and like most botanists getting going, I kind of thought of oak as Quercus X, and that's as far as I wanted to have anything to do with oaks. They sounded complicated, and they weren't very pretty, you know, colorful flowers and all that. I met Kevin Nixon and Kelly Steele, two graduate students who were working on oaks at that time. And they really piqued my interest when, during one of our last Botany of 103, that's the Flora of Vegetation of California classes, they did a little presentation on this mysterious new oak they'd found down at Torrey Pines. And they hadn't quite named it yet. I later found that they considered calling it Quercus moranii after Reed Moran, who has done a lot of work in Baja California and San Diego County. And it was an interesting little oak. Most of you know it today as Quercus demosa, but we didn't know that at the time. In fact, actually, we found it in Orange County as soon as I went home for my summer vacation, and or I call that between classes. I found it, in fact, about 6 or 7 places in Orange County, and then I got kind of hooked on chasing oaks, and then sort of followed Kelly and Kevin and got interested in a lot of stuff they're doing. And then later, when we actually put the name of Quercus demosa on the oaks, I had so many questions about it. People asking me all the time, what is this thing and how you tell it? I wrote a book about oaks for Southern California, which a bunch of you probably have. Anyway, that's probably enough about how I got into this. You're probably actually all wanting to speak about oaks. So let's see if I can figure out how to do this again. I assume that's where I am here. Oops, the host has disabled my screen sharing again. Joseph, you've got to undo that. Got it? All right, here we go. All right, hopefully everybody can see this. If you're in the right class, you're Oaks of San Diego County. Does that look like that? Good. All right. The oaks are actually one of California's most recognizable plants. I don't think that even most of you who don't really consider themselves botanists or just sort of interested a little bit in natural history, almost all of you know what an oak is. You may not necessarily know what name to put on it, but it's a very recognizable group. It's actually true over most of its range across the world. And of course, it's got acorns on it that makes it all the easier, but just something about the leaves, something about the shape and the overall structure of these plants that lend to some sort of recognition. This particular oak here is a coast live oak from up in the Lake Henshaw area. We've got lots of trees. Well, and, for California, we've got lots of trees in the oak group. But even more species of shrubs. They're sort of ubiquitous across any of the California natural wild landscapes and west of the deserts. Anytime you've got a sort of a gallery forest, it's probably got it it's probably loaded with oaks. A lot of slopes of oaks. It's a big component of chaparral in a lot of areas. You know, of course, woodlands, most of our Southern California woodlands at moderate and low elevation will almost always be oaks. But of course, in San Diego County, it's a very important plant. You'll find it pretty much right up into the desert border regions, right down on the coast pretty much. And, you know, most of our favorite woodland areas in San Diego County are probably going to be dominated by oaks. This is that lake, this picture here is Lake Sutherland. The oaks are members of the beech family, that Fagaceae, for those who want the both names on that. And this is pretty much a temperate region family. The genus Quercus itself is more or less a northern hemisphere species or group family found across the both the old and new world areas. A little bit gets down into the uh, almost down to the equator in Colombia. In the southern hemisphere, you've got the southern beaches, which is mostly Nothofagus, which is kind of a comparable sister genus to oaks in a sense. But you don't have any true oaks south of the equator. We have 3 genera in California. We have Quercus, the true oaks, and we've got Chrysolepis, which is one of our mountain genera, Syncopen, and then what used to be called Lithocarpus, now it's called Notholithocarpus, just because they want to confuse people. That's the tanbark oak, which is found mostly in Central California. All 3 of these essentially have something akin to an acorn. And on Quercus, it's the most obvious. The acorn cup, which has scales on it, middle tubercles or scales are pretty much naked. If you look at Nothocarpus, you can see that those same sorts of scales now become almost spiny and elongated. And it's even more extreme in Chrysolepis, where it's just becomes a little burr with somewhere in there they've got a nut. If you're looking at the flowers for the oaks and their other genera in the beech family, they aren't much help really for identification. The catkins is basically sort of doesn't really have a very pretty flower attached to it. And aside from the fact that, for example, in Nothocarpus, the catkins tend to be relatively long. They're a bit more slender, but still fairly dense, Chrysolepis, and they tend to be a bit shorter and more open. And Quercus, they really have not much help if you're trying to figure out species. So I usually don't dwell a whole lot on the male part, the catkins of the oaks. Quercus is a very diverse group. It probably in the Western Hemisphere probably reaches its maximum diversity in Mexico. And you just get a very, very wide assortment of leaf sizes and shapes. Now, most of you who have come from back east know that most of the oaks in the eastern part of the United States lose their leaves, they're deciduous. A lot of our Western oaks tend to be evergreen. So we have the trees and shrubs, and it's one example of some of the diversity here. This is in one highway in Mexico. One of my favorite places to botanize is the highlands above Mazatlan. There's a highway often called the Durango Highway, running between the city of Mazatlan and Durango. And it's got something on the order of 40 species of oaks growing along it, which is a pretty impressive lot. And here's 3 of the oaks you could find there. There's an awful lot of oaks along the Durango Highway I don't recognize. And it's probably even worse if you consider hybrids. But these are dramatic. We've got Quercus viminea. Basically, it's sort of named after like a willow type structure. And then we got Quercus laureana, which is sort of like a umbellularia type leaf. And then one of my favorites is Quercus magnifolia. That black item there is a lens cap. As you can see, it's a very, very large and dramatic leaf. So this gives you kind of a rundown of where diversity on oaks is in North America. Basically, the lighter yellow colors or white is there's no oaks. We don't have a lot of places in North America that don't have oaks. You've got to go to some of the islands in the Caribbean, Quintana Roo in Mexico, Idaho, and Montana, United States. And then if you get to greens and blues, we get a higher diversity. And one of the things you can see right off the bat is that Texas is probably the place to go to look at oaks in the United States. So it's because you've got both the arid habitats to the west, you've got a little bit of Mexico kind of poking in from the south, and you've got the east coming in from the southeast area. So you have these different major habitats coming together. In fact, the Southeast has a fair number of oak species on it, but they're all the same for the most part. Most of those 26 species of oaks you can find in Florida are also in Georgia and in Arkansas. The difference being out west, where California is, most of our oaks actually don't occur anywhere else. They might occur a bit more in Oregon, a little bit in Arizona, and a little bit in Baja California, but otherwise they're pretty much Californian. We have a pretty good variety here in California, about 21 species or so. And it's comparable to many states in the East and many of the states in Mexico. States in Mexico are generally smaller, so in a way they're a little bit at a disadvantage. So it's impressive that a small state like, well, you can see some of those there. They're about a third of the size as California, and most of them have the same number of species. Even this country of Guatemala has 31. So this is why I was saying about if you start looking at where the endemics are, California is actually really far ahead of most of the other locations in North America. Very few places have diversity even remotely matching ours. We have 17 species that are found pretty much in California and not found elsewhere. To sort of emphasize that, I put together this nice little mosaic here showing the different species of oaks that are in California. Pardon me, that's Chianti wandering by. She seems to show up whenever I do a Zoom presentation. She's kind of like wants attention, I guess. Anyway, so here you've got these different, showing the different forms that we have, basically leaves for each species we have. But if you look at San Diego County, we've got about half of them here in San Diego County. So that's pretty good. We have more oaks in San Diego County than any other county in California, I believe. I was working on that this afternoon to find out if that was true, and I didn't quite get that far. But if we're not the #1 county for oaks, we are certainly in the top 3 counties. But what are some of the important features when you're looking at oaks and trying to sort out what you're looking at? One, you want to look at the habit. Basically, are you looking at a tree or a shrub? You want to look at the leaf shape. On the left, we have an example of a fairly lobed leaf, and on the far right, we have a very entire leaf, and you've got leaves that are dentate with dentate margins in between. Or is the leaf deciduous, or is it evergreen? Those are the kind of things you look at if you're trying to sort these things out. Trichomes are actually a very important part of identifying oaks, particularly white oaks. White oaks are our most confusing group of oaks, and it's very handy to start learning how the trichomes work to try to sort them out. The problem with the trichomes is they're very small. So unless you've got a good dissecting scope, a really, really nice hand lens, or an electron microscope, you're probably going to have a little trouble trying to sort this out because all you can see, for the most part, whether they're hairs or not. Fortunately, there's a few species where the hairs are large enough that you can actually see them pretty well with the naked eye, and that actually helps. In some cases, that's one of the diagnostic characters. Yeah, I can see the oak hairs. That means it's going to be these species. And then finally, here's another image of the trichome showing, again, emphasizing them. Here's showing the trichomes of Quercus corneus mulleri on the left and Quercus demost on the right. These are pretty much close to scale. The first thing you can see is that the corneus mulleri has very, very dense overlapping trichomes. And actually, they have as many as 16 arms on their trichomes, little star-shaped hairs. You can't see the surface of the leaf at all. But if you look at Quercus demosa, for example, you can see the surface of the leaf. The trichomes are kind of like spider webs. They got stuck on the other side of the leaf. They're much, much longer. So those are two of the most obvious, most distinctive trichome sets you can get. Unfortunately, there's a lot of them in between that aren't quite going to be so easy to sort out. But it does become pretty important as we hear later. And finally, the acorn shape and the acorn cup can be important to identification. For example, looking down below, you can see that on the acorn on the cup on the left, you have sort of a warty looking appearance to the acorn, tuberculate. Basically, it is warty. And if you look on the right, you'll see that the acorn cups are scaled. And those are two actually sort of indicators of two different groups of oaks, which is a good hint of which direction to go and to identify these things. The acorn scales being really scale shaped, or is actually more of a juvenile character. Most of the oaks actually start out with scaled acorns, and then the white oaks tend to lose them. If you were back east again, you would probably think the bark is something we really need to look at. And actually, the bark is probably pretty important on some species, but in our case, there are so many other characters that are easy or helpful for trying to sort out oaks. And there's not that many tree species. We usually don't have to worry a whole lot about bark in California. It's probably not a bad idea to know something of the bark. Of course, the bark on Engelmann's oak looks pretty different than the bark on Kellogg's, on California black oak, for example. But most of the time, you can tell those two pretty easily by one having very large divided leaves, or no leaves at all when it loses them in the winter, and the other one having the sort of blue-gray leaves. So, you know, we don't really worry as much about bark on that. Now, if you're in Georgia, you might think differently, since you had 20 species of trees growing back there, and they all look the same in the winter, that is, no leaves. Well, I think a few of them might still have leaves, but anyway, so we skipped that to the class here. Okay, so this is in California. We have three readily identifiable groups of oaks. We have what many of us have called the black oaks, although I've been told by a number of people that probably we really should be calling these red oaks, which is more like what you technically call them if you're back east. So that was section Lovitae, if you want to know the Latin thing of it. And then there's the golden oaks, which is a very old group, and the white oaks, section Quercus. The golden oaks actually date back about 50 million to 60 million years. So those are the ones that we sort of start with. Now, just as some of the differences on these, for the red oaks, the acorn cups have flat scales on them, and it's pretty obvious when you've got those. The acorns, they mature in 2 years, and the leaves typically are either glabrous or their hairs are mostly restricted to the underside of the leaf. In golden oaks, the acorn cups are a bit more warty looking. They're sometimes quite large. The Quercus chrysolipus, the canyon live oak, has a very large acorn cup. Pretty nasty if you throw it at somebody, which is something people in high school, our high school, used to do occasionally. The acorns also mature in about 2 years, and usually has sort of a golden or silvery hair and waxy coatings on the leaves. And in the white oaks, they've got a sort of a nice polished looking, warty, tuberculate acorn cup. They actually mature in 1 year. Now, just was a note that not all the black oaks actually mature in 2 years. One exception is Quercus agrifolia. And I never really picked up on that too much until somebody in Israel wrote me a letter when they bought my book and said, hey, we've got this cool black oak over here that matures in 1 year. You've got one too. Hey, that's exciting. I didn't know about that. Anyway, so the white oaks, pretty much, the leaves are always hairy to some degree. You may not necessarily see it, but there's sort of a grayish look to them. That usually is an indicator that they've got hairs on the leaves. And you see down below in that picture, in fact, you can see that there's hairs on both sides of the leaves. So we'll kind of go over the black oaks first in San Diego County. And we have 3 species and a couple different varieties in addition to those. Coast live oak. This is our predominant tree species for oaks in San Diego County. Chiefly found away from the immediate coast, really a foothill oak, and it does get up into the higher mountains. There are higher mountains here, we can go about 6,000 feet at most, but mostly it's found a little bit lower. it's also fairly widespread in Southern California, and it probably was found throughout the LA basin at one point, although because I always hear that that sort of had more of a savanna back before it had a city on it. Oh, an obvious feature is it's a tree. And here you find it, back to that one original picture I had, it showing a typical Quercus agrifolia dominated woodland. Or in gallery forest, you find it in the deeper canyons. Usually not because so much there's a stream in the canyon, but there's actually shading coming in from the steep slopes on either side and allows a higher moisture retention. So you end up getting trees where otherwise you would have shrubs. And you find scattered around on various slopes in coastal sage and chaparral as well. Oh, typical of a black oak, Quercus agrifolia has scaled acorn cups. The acorns tend to be fusiform, that is, they tend to be a little bit narrow, slender, and they often have lines on them, as you can see here. There's just showing the acorn cups again in the middle, but the most noteworthy thing you can tell on this is that the leaves are kind of bubble shaped. That's a characteristic of Quercus agrifolia. The underside for the nominate variety, that's Quercus agrifolia, which is found basically Northern California south, pretty much down to San Diego County. I don't remember if that gets into Baja or not. It's basically glabrous. It doesn't have many hairs on the other side of the leaf. And it has, you can't really see it too well in this photograph, but little tufts of hair in the leaf axils. That's a very characteristic thing for Quercus agrifolia. And the upper side of the leaf charlie doesn't have any hairs on it. The other form, which is mostly found in central San Diego South, though there are a few scattered locations farther north, like up, I think there's been one found in Pasadena and some in the Santa Ana Mountains, is Quercus agrifolia variation occidentale, which is, I've been calling it the southern coast live oak. Pretty much a lot of features are the same on that, except for that it's got a really hairy leaf underside, sometimes almost tomentose and white. One of the confusions is if you go through the various keys or you're trying to identify these oaks and you're in other areas, is if it says it's hairy underneath, well, there's various gradations of hairs, and just a few hairs underneath doesn't make it occidentale. You can have just a little bit here and there, and I would still call it agrifolia. When you see the stuff that's really hairy, you know that it's agrifolia occidentale. Here's a really nice example. You can see two things here. One, you can see that sort of curl bubble-shaped leaf for Quercus agrifolia it gets, and on the right photo, you can just see this thing is solidly white underneath it. Very beautiful oak leaf. In the mountains, actually mountains throughout Southern California at higher elevations, mostly over 4,000 feet, we've got California black oak, Quercus kellogii. And this is a tree, it's a deciduous tree, pretty much found, this is actually a picture in the San Jacinto Mountains. I should have got one for San Diego County. But you can kind of see that the way it grows mixed in these conifer forests where you've just got this, you can see the yellows scattered throughout this photo. That's the Quercus kellogii growing in along the conifer forest. A lot of these areas burned in San Diego County about 20 years ago, and they're still recovering. So we don't have the best mixtures of forest anymore. The most characteristic feature of this oak is that it's got a relatively large leaf. It's pretty much glabrous. There's just a little bit of hairs on the underside. And it's got these very deep sinuses. Basically, it's got deep lobes on it and it's got little spines on the tips of the leaves. It's a good example on some of the lobes to the base. You can see that the spine there. I don't know, might have a cursor goes anywhere. Okay. It's a deciduous tree, which is also something a little unusual for our Southern California oaks. We don't have very many deciduous species. The other deciduous species that we've got in Southern California is Quercus garryana, which is found only in Los Angeles County in our area. It also has similar leaves, but they're, well, actually Quercus lobata is up in that area too, and it's also deciduous, but we don't have either of those in San Diego County. So this is your last opportunity. If you want to race out to the mountains right about now, you can still catch these things with leaves on them, and they'll mostly be yellow, but sometime in the next month or so, their leaves are all going to be gone. It's got a fairly large, fairly broad acorn, and the cups are very sharp, very nicely scaled. A very good example if you want to have a scaled acorn cup. Another of our black oaks is interior live oak, Quercus wislesinii. There's two forms of Quercus wislesinii. The tree form is pretty uncommon in Southern California. This map needs to be updated. It's a little bit more common than it's shown here. In fact, I just added a dot for trees that have been found up in the Palomar Mountains. At the time I originally did my oak book, we didn't have any records for the tree form in San Diego County. Otherwise, it's found mostly at moderate elevations in mountain regions up into Central California, or I think actually Northern California. Mostly in Northern California, you get a lot of the tree form. This is one of those oaks where it's a little tricky, depending on who you talk to. The variety is kind of merged a little bit. And basically what it boils down to is that if you get them in a wet habitat, they can be developed into trees. Into a drier habitat, they tend to be shrubs. Does that really make them different varieties or not? Because you can find them sort of mixing. There's typical habitat for Quercus wislesinii variation frutescens on a Montgomery Peak, yes, over Montezuma Peak, overlooking Anza-Borrego. The leaves are relatively flat on Quercus wislesinii. They can be entire, like as you see here, with no teeth on them, or they can have teeth on them. But for the most part, no hairs and flat makes one of the things. It's a very standard lanceolate sort of shaped leaf also. Now, keeping in mind that when we say there's no hairs, it's really no hairs on a mature leaf. Almost all oaks start out with a bit of hairs on the leaf when they're very young, when they first start coming out. So that can be a little fooling sometimes. There's nothing too descriptive about the acorn. It's got a scaled acorn cup. It's a moderate size. It's about the same size of most of our shrub oaks. And of course, frutescens is our shrubby form, often sort of densely shrubby. And then the tree form, oh, I guess we don't have a tree form. All right, here, this is just showing you the difference in the leaves here. The here's an example of it where it actually has teeth. The one thing I would love to do sometime is actually put together more pictures showing the variety and diversity that the oak leaves present, because that's can be very tricky when you're first getting into this. This is actually not from Mount Palomar. I've never actually seen the Quercus wislesinii on Mount Palomar. But if you go to Central California, like here in Santa Cruz County, the tree form is everywhere. Here's a classic example hanging over the road. That central tree is Quercus wislesinii. Typically, the trees have larger leaves than the shrubs do. How about twice to almost 3 times the size? So hybrids in black oaks are a lot of fun. I like the hybrids of black oaks. They're recognizable. They're not insane. They're just, and they're kind of easy to sort out. unlike the white oaks, black oaks seem to hybridize sporadically. And the only rule is that you've got to have the two parent species nearby. And there won't be a lot. There'll just be one plant here and there scattered around that'll have the characters of the both parents. And usually you can tell the characters pretty well. You can tell which parent you're looking at when you look at these oaks. This is Quercus morehouse, Oracle oak, and its leaves are larger than your typical Quercus wislesinii, and they tend to have just a little bit more of a more lobing than you would get in Quercus wislesinii. The parent is Quercus kellogii. The other thing you get in this one, it's also evergreen. It's not deciduous. One of the things you can tell. One of the things you can tell with is if you look at the acorn, it's a Quercus kellogii acorn, just straight. So that's kind of nice. Until recently, I've only seen the shrub form of Quercus wislesinii or Quercus morehouse. And I've just heard from Margie Mulligan that she's just recently seen this down in San Diego County somewhere. This particular one is found at San Jacinto Mountains, where there's a few more of them around, but it actually has a tree element. There's nothing particularly different about the cross that causes the tree versus the shrub in basic leaf shape. The leaves tend to be, leaves tend to be a bit bigger. I think what you're getting here is this Quercus wislesinii crossing with kellogii versus frutescens crossing with kellogii. You don't see too much of it down here, but it's kind of neat when you find one. Another cross with Quercus kellogii is Quercus ganderi. This is Gander's oak. There's only a handful of them in San Diego County, and we're fortunate that one of them is quite. Hang on here. You know what the other one is on my snake cage? This particular one is by the Vulcan Mountain School on Highway 79. That's just north of San Isabel. So it's pretty easy to locate. It's a very pretty tree, big rounded thing. And unlike Quercus kellogii, it's evergreen. So why do we think this one's a hybrid? Well, the leaves are large like kellogii, but they're not very deeply incised. They're more like large lobes with often spine-tip margins. The acorn is also pretty much just a straight Quercus kellogii type acorn. But the underside of the leaf is very hairy. Essentially, the underside of the leaf is getting this hairs from Quercus agrifolia. So this is a cross between Quercus agrifolia variation occidentania and Quercus kellogii. Well, that's kind of neat. But it's getting some of the features from kellogii. One of the features it's getting from agrifolia is the evergreen part. So let's move on to the next group of oaks here in San Diego County. And again, remembering that we have more oak species in San Diego County than I think we have in any other county. This would be a much shorter program in Quercus in Orange County, for example. Anyway, we've got Cedros Island oak, Canyon oak, and we've got Palmer's oak. Cedros Island oak was one of those ones that we didn't actually know was here until well, it seemed recent to me, but I guess it's not so recent anymore. I spent several years learning all over Mexico trying to find this crazy thing, and finally found it. And like the very next year was out with a Fish and Wildlife Service conservation group, Border Patrol survey and Otay Mountain area before they're going to start obliterating everything with fences and such, and expanding all the roads. And we found Quercus kellogii or Quercus cedrosensis out on Otay Mountain, and that was kind of neat. It tends to be more of a it's sort of a mat forming oak, and it's particularly obvious in this picture. We get the sort of dense mat spreading across the canyon floor. It's not really much bigger than the other oaks. The leaves are quite different though. They're small, often shiny, bicolored. They're light below and darker green above. They can be spiny. They can be sort of entire margin. They look a little bit, you can find leaves in Quercus chrysalis that look almost exactly like it, but they're typically much larger. Here's one that has more of a chrysalis look to it, but they're fairly small. They're going to be about 15 millimeters to 20 millimeters or so long. Found it only relatively coastal areas for the most part. Well, not coastal being a relative term, say within 15 miles of the coast. Except for down you get on the Sierra San Pedro Martir, and you actually find it getting fairly far up onto the mountain. Originally, it was found on Cedros Island. Not too much to say about the acorn. It has kind of that typical scrub oak acorn look to it. One of my favorite things is when people bring me a pile of acorns and say, "What are these oaks?" You know, they all look like pretty much the same species to me most of the time. I've got to see the leaves to sort them out. So our most important member of the golden oak group is canyon live oak, which again are mountain species found particularly in canyons and more mesic sites, where you can say things like interior live oak or canyon oak woodland, for example. And we found it in most of our interior mountains in San Diego County, from Mount Palomar down into the Laguna Mountain area. You can see from that map, it actually is fairly widespread in mountains across Southern California, and including the Santa Ana Mountains, which seems to miss some of the mountain species of oaks. There's just a picture of the tree here. It's a tree, but it can actually be a shrub as well. It's a little confused about which group it wants to fall into. And then there's the bicolored leaf. There's one of the spiny versions of this leaf. So it can be quite different. Again, what we find here is the cooler mesic sites, it tends to have an entire leaf, one without edges or one without teeth on it. If it's on a dry site, it tends to have smaller leaves that have a lot more teeth. One of the more characteristic things of this oak is it's got really big acorns. We like to call them massive acorn cups. Very thick. It's the only one of ours that actually does that. But if you're just immediately south of the border in Baja California, that acorn side of things seems to shift. So it seems to be tied to the degree of summer rainfall and winter rainfall. We get more winter rainfall north of the border than south, and it might have something to do with it. Palmer's oak is more of a desert edge oak. We get particularly in the Santa Rosa Mountain foothills and eastern parts of the San Jacinto Mountains south into Baja California. It's the most reliable place to find it in San Diego County is in the Boulevard area, McCain Valley. Usually has sort of a curled leaf. They tend to be very hard, the spines on them. One of my great tests and tell people they can do, grab a leaf and squeeze it. If it hurts, it's probably Quercus palmeri. It's really stiff, and it's actually not a good idea to squeeze the leaf. There's some of the spines you can see on this thing. Has a very distinctive acorn, kind of like a mushroom. The acorn cup flares out beyond the acorn itself, so it makes it a pretty easy plant to identify. And the white oaks, we've got 4 clear species in San Diego County. Anyway, there's been some debate about whether we have 5 or not. California scrub oak, Muller's oak, Nuttall's scrub oak, and Engelmann's oak. And if you were botanizing in San Diego County in 1953, you only had 2 species. 3 of those species were all considered the same, which seems almost remarkable to me. This is one of the groups where it's really important to know the trichomes on it. Generally, these are diagrammatic, so they can give you a feel for how things are. Some of the species have larger acorn or larger trichomes, others have smaller ones. Some are thinner, some are thicker. So the most common one in Southern California and Central California is Quercus berberifolia. It's the actual extent in San Diego County is just a little bit uncertain, depending on who you talk to. It's pretty widespread, or maybe it's not quite so widespread. Basically, it's a shrub. It's one of our more common elements. But this is a picture at the Santa Rosa Plateau, where you can see quite a bit of it mixing in with Quercus anglomanii. The leaves tend to be, the way I've always treated Quercus berberifolia, tend to be relatively elongate with moderate width. The more important element is that the upper leaf surface tends to be glabrous or close to glabrous with very few hairs on, and the underside of the leaf has fewer hairs. It doesn't have really super dense hairs, although that's a relative term. Once we started counting these things, we realized that Quercus berberifolia has plenty of hairs underneath if you start getting down to how many per millimeter, for example, but it is a lot less than some of our other species. There's again a typical scrub oak acorn. Muller's oak, which is interesting, in a paper in 1953, Muller alludes to it, why he probably got named after this oak. Said one of those oaks on the east edge of San Diego County are sure strange. Somebody should take another look at those things. And eventually they did, and named a new oak out of it. You know, the one thing about these scrub oaks, if you look at them from a distance, they all look kind of the same. You might catch a little bit of a different grayness or green or whatever. But so most cases, you don't have to worry about the general form of it. This one is got a special character to it. One, it's got a really hairy upper leaf surfaces, which is pretty unusual in most of our scrub oaks. And the underside is just really densely hairy. So hairy that you can't actually see the leaf underneath it at all. And the other trick about this one is it's got generally 12 to 16 arms on its trichomes, and some of them are fused. That makes it stand out from other oaks. Overall, all that hair gives it sort of a grayish yellow-green appearance when you see the oak. The acorn's really, well, this was kind of dramatic because it's got one of them brown and one of them green, but overall it still has that general scrub oak acorn appearance, so it's not very helpful for identification. I think my favorite personal one is Quercus demosus. This is the oak that got me into dealing with oaks in the first place. And this was in fact, the first shrub I found for it back in 1983. It's still out there on the Dana Point Headland. It's just this one shrub out in the middle of the sandy area. And we've kind of been monitoring it now for 40 years. As you can see from the map below, it's not a very widely distributed oak. It was found in Santa Barbara or rediscovered in Santa Barbara in the mid-1980s. And that was the key to realizing that this is the same oak that Thomas Nuttall collected in 1835. And of course, for confusion, the name Quercus demosus was applied to all the scrub oaks of Southern California and Northern California. And then once they changed the name, it's taken another 15 to 20 years to get that name out. So we don't really have Quercus demosus in Napa County after all. But you can still see it occasionally on records that way. Its largest distribution is actually in Western San Diego County, mostly coastal, but getting a bit inland. And the farther east you get, it gets a little bit more confused as to what you're looking at. It starts mixing with the next oak inland, Quercus berberifolia. At least that was my theory anyway. There's a picture of it growing in one of the coastal canyons down in San Diego, fairly dense. One of the characters of this oak, it's actually the farthest inland in San Diego County, is on Otay Mesa area, just east of Otay Lake, about 7 miles inland. That's as far as we get today. The leaf is relatively small. It tends to be either round or a little bit elongated, always has teeth, tends to be wavy all the time. But what the most striking character is the hairs are long enough that you can see them with your plain eye. Although I have to admit, now that my eyes are getting old, I don't see them as well as I used to see them. I used to be able to joke about other people older not being able to see them, but now I'm getting that way too. But I can still see them. But you just turn the leaf sideways and usually you can see that hair on it, whereas the other oaks, you won't see that. Again, here's a little close-up. You can see those hairs on that. Very dense, tangled growth, often has red branches. The branches are angular. They're usually about 90-degree angles. Most of the other scrub oaks tend to be just sort of arching upward, and this one tends to be sort of darting in all kinds of different angles. You could pretty much step over the thing. One of the other crazy things about it is that it loses leaves like crazy. In fact, if you try to press it, half the leaves sometimes fall out as you're trying to get the plant pressed. It looks like a deciduous tree when you're, or shrub when you look underneath it. As it turns out, it's semi-deciduous. If it's really dry, if it's really cold, it can lose all its leaves. That's what happened to our Dana Point plant. Several times it looked like it died, and then it just came back the following years when things, when it got moisture again. So that's one way to go out and find this. Really good examples of Quercus domosa. Go look for them in January. They probably don't have many leaves on them, whereas the berberifolia all looks great. So they don't usually have that in the books as a character, but semi-deciduous leaves seems to be something that's kind of true with this one. Helps to identify them too. And here's what it looks like in the winter in Dana Point, for example. Just a tangle of dead-looking branches. Not a leaf to be seen. Ours is usually not quite that drastic down here. The other thing is, through much of its range for domosa, it actually retains the juvenile character of scaled acorn cups, which is kind of neat. Except for in San Diego County, it won't do it. There's some in Penasquitos Canyon area, there's some that actually get scaled acorn cups, but the rest of the area is confusing. When I first moved to Encinitas, I was very confused by this. And it took me a while to realize what's happening is it's hybridizing with berberifolia, and there were almost no solidly pure domosa down here. A little bit Torrey pines, but most of it's got a little bit of hybridization or a little influence in it. So you usually don't see the acorn cups with scaled cups down here. Apparently in Orange County and Santa Barbara County, they're reproductively isolated by about a month. In San Diego County, the other scrub oaks and Quercus domosa tend to overlap in blooming. Quercus engelmanii, this is our most majestic of our white oaks. Mostly found in interior San Diego County, but it actually extends up into the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains as well. Beautiful blue, gray, green colors, but as a warning, apparently you've got to be in the right light and the right angle. If you don't get that right light and angle, you kind of don't get as much of that pretty blue gray. I think, for example, here, this looks a little bit more green. You can see it's sort of the sprawling, the large trees get sort of wide. Very distinctive leaf on the good pure engelmanii. Nice sort of oblong shape. The entire margins, that blue gray really stands out. The leaves are pretty large, they're 2.5 to 3.5 inches long or so. They get a little bit semi-deciduous in the winter as well sometimes. I was really annoyed to find out the trichomes on Quercus engelmanii aren't as useful as they are other ones, because the trichomes tend to be much more deciduous on its tree species. I've gone through specimen after specimen, they're dried, no trichomes on the things. It makes it hard when you're trying to compare, seeing what kind of hybridization is going on. The acorns tend to be kind of barrel shaped. This is one of the ones where the acorns actually look different. They tend to be fairly, and they also tend to have a fairly shallow cup also. They're smaller acorns. If you look at typical scrub oak acorn, you'll see these are actually smaller than you would normally find on things. So I was originally going to devote a little bit more time to hybrids and decided I'm not quite ready for that yet, but we're still going to talk about them a bit. Combination, San Diego County it's not the only place in California that has a real hybrid issue, but it is one of the places that has some of the most complicated hybrid issues. There's actually 4 relatively common potential hybrid combinations in San Diego County. But if you look at the herbarium record, you right away realize that's not what people are actually looking at these oaks from. There's a couple hybrids that really stand out. The number one standing out one is Cornelius Mulleri by engelmanii, which is called Quercus acutidens. If you're reading Jepson anyway, but there is a lot of debate right now. One, is it the right hybrid combination? Is it really Cornelius Mulleri by engelmanii, or is it berberifolia by engelmanii? And then the other one is it actually just its own full species? So there's been quite a debate among some of the botanists in San Diego County for this. For example, the San Diego Natural History crew tends to call a lot more stuff acutidens than I call. They actually use a somewhat different character than I do, which is also interesting too. So we have to sort that out. whereas they tend to use a much more narrow leaf. I tend to use a more broad leaf. So we're still working on that. Some of the other one that you've probably seen, especially if you're an iNaturalist user, you've seen the name Quercus dentata show up as another named hybrid for San Diego County. And if you looked at Owen Beecham's books, for example, he has it listed right there as San Diego. The problem with Quercus dentata, though, is it's from Pasadena. It's a hybrid between Engelmannii and another scrub oak called Dorata gabrielensis. There isn't Dorata gabrielensis anywhere near San Diego County. So it means that the name actually only applies to oaks that are for the most part found in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains and the old Pasadena area, where there was one time a pretty hefty population of Quercus engelmannii. Now the most of Quercus engelmannii is left over in people's backyards if you go up to Monrovia and such. So this particular type specimen was actually from Monrovia, which is quite a ways away from San Diego. So no Quercus dentata in San Diego, even if you see that name on places like iNaturalist as being here. It just isn't here. It's one of the other hybrids. So we have a couple, and one of them that's, I think, really underrated in San Diego County is the combination of Quercus berberifolia and engelmannii. This partly depends on how widely spread you think the berberifolia is in San Diego County. If it's actually pretty widespread in San Diego County, it's got to be the primary hybrid with engelmannii. Engelmannii it's not supposed to be super readily hybridizing, but its influence sure gets around. In fact, one of the complications is that there's a couple papers that show that as soon as engelmannii gets in the neighborhood, it starts influencing the scrub oaks around it quite a bit. And you can see that influence up into Los Angeles County, and even in the western parts of Los Angeles County. Probably engelmannii once occurred there. It's hard to say. And all through Riverside, Orange, and San Diego County, you see this. But the shape of the leaf here is more of an entire, but sometimes it's got teeth on it. Still fits very similar to what people would also call Quercus acutidens. The reason we know there's going to be some Quercus engelmannii mixed into a lot of these oaks is when Kelly Steele and Kevin Nixon did their work, they found that a fair number of our scrub oaks actually had, this is a weird little thing, their cotyledons were partly fused and they're variably fused. In other words, sometimes where the cotyledons had a little bit of fusion, sometimes they had a lot of fusion. Well, it turns out only one oak in, I think, in Western North America practically only has fused acorns in the white oak group, and that's Quercus, or in California, that's Quercus engelmannii. So if you've got the shrubs that are getting these fused cotyledon character on it, it's probably got Quercus engelmannii in it. That unfortunately doesn't tell you whether you're looking at berberifolia as a parent or Cornelius mulleri. And when I recently talked to Kevin Nixon, we didn't cover anything to be sure how that worked out. But we also know what true Cornelius mulleri and engelmannii crossed would look like. This again, if you look at the Jepson manual, this is what the name Quercus acutidens is applied to in the Jepson manual. This was the concept that was put out back in the 1980s. If we have the plants growing right next to each other, it's a site in the banding where you get engelmannii and Cornelius mulleri actually growing almost in contact, and sure enough, there's hybrids there. But they tend to be trees or really, really big shrubs, and the leaves tend to be broader. They tend to be very hairy and really much more like Cornelius mulleri. But most of our stuff that we've been calling acutidens across San Diego County doesn't really look anything like this tree. So is that just a matter of more variability, or is the concept overused a little bit? And of course, the other thing that we don't hear a whole lot, what happens if berberifolia and Cornelius mulleri cross? Go look at the consortium someday. I think you'll find like one specimen ever identified as that hybrid form. It's got to be a fairly common hybrid form in eastern San Diego County. So one of the complications is more recently, we've got people who have suggested that, and actually Tom Chester was the first person to suggest this about 10 years ago, is that maybe Quercus acutidens is its own species, and it's really more of a Southern California species. One of the reasons this has come up is because if you actually look at the type specimen for Quercus berberifolia, and this is a little confusing. I have two specimens here. One's a type and one's, I believe, an isotype. The one on the left is the one that you find at the Kew Herbarium in England. And that one, it would be the lower right leaf. They were actually calling it Quercus agrifolia at the time, and it's a fairly broad, rounded leaf. It's a little better if you look on the specimen to the right, which was found by a botanist named Gary Wallace, lost in the Trinity College Herbarium at Dublin, where apparently Coulter had a lot of the specimens. It's pretty much off the same piece. And it looks like some of the specimens here look a little bit more like what we typically see as Quercus berberifolia. So that sort of rounded, smaller leaf look to it would be one way to look at that. So the specimen, this type specimen for Quercus acutidens, though, does look a lot more like what we typically call our scrub oaks down here. And of course, part of the problem with that is that you got to watch it because you're just because the type doesn't have a really good location or maybe not the best type in the world, doesn't mean it's not a good type. You can get better stuff designated later. You can't see on these sheets is what's going on with the hairs on these two specimens. And unfortunately, because of COVID-19, I was actually hoping to at least go look at one or two of them this last year, but it didn't work because they didn't go anywhere. You can get some nice photographs of the specimens, but you can't see the trichomes on them, so you know what's going on there yet. But anyway, so what it really boils down to is there's some real complications yet that still need to be ironed out for what is happening with the hybrids. What are the hybrids down here? What exactly is Quercus acutidens? The biggest problem we have is the keys don't do a good job on this. We need to figure out how to rewrite them. This is what I've been calling Quercus acutidens for the last many, many years. So generally a larger wire leaf. As Kevin Nixon described, it's reminiscent of Quercus pacifica. And this looks much more like Quercus pacifica than the narrow leaves that we that sometimes get called acutidens. So I'm still trying to decide where we go with this thing. And I believe that is the end of it. And since Vince's showing up, it means that I'm probably going over my hours here.
That's fine. No, you're doing just fine. We just have a lot of questions, a lot of really good questions. I think there's 35 questions so far. So we're going to do bullet speed questions and answers. I've curated these down to the most interesting. Some are very interesting. So give short answers if you don't mind, because we've got lots of them. First question about GSOB. What's the current status of GSOB if you want to weigh in, or you have an opinion about that? Gold spot.
So,
Gold spotted oak borer.
Unfortunately, I'm an oak ID guy. I don't know I can't tell you a whole lot about the parasites and insect threats to this.
We'll save that for others then. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. What are the highest altitude oaks found? Which species, I guess, would be the highest altitude?
In California, it was probably Quercus vaccinifolia, I'm pretty sure. I know I've collected that at over 9,000 feet.
Wow. Wow.
And it does go to snow.
What about San Diego? San Diego County.
Oh, sorry, Josh, before you leave with that, I just wanted to point out, people caught that last little thing on my program there. I had my FMR publications thing up just to point out to people that I've still got oak shirts. I just got a new set of them. So that'll be showing up on my website soon. So I guess if somebody needs my website.
Yeah, we'll give you that promo in a minute here. So where does the word Quercus come from? Quercus.
Where does the word Quercus come from? I don't actually know that at the top of my head.
Okay, we'll look that one up on Google.
So far, not many ID questions.
No. So is there, does the cap size indicate the amount of tannins? There's some sort of a rumor about that the bigger the cap, the more tannins in that acorn.
I don't believe that is true. I think that the tannins are really tied to which species it is, not how big the cap is on it.
Is there any sort of a DNA database of San Diego County oaks that you know of?
Well, there's not a San Diego one specifically, I don't think, but there are people who have got genetic works, like, for example, Victoria Sorka at UCLA has been putting together a big catalog of California DNA stuff, and there's people across the West that are working on it.
Can hybrids go either way? In other words, can they express more like the female tree versus the male, or do they pretty much kind of go one way?
Okay, oaks are both male and female.
That's right. I had forgotten that.
Yeah, was
Just
that a trick
reading this.
question?
Yeah. Okay. Never mind that one then. Question about your new book. You going to reprint or update or provide
It's
some sort of
being
new book?
updated. I'm stalling because I'm trying to sort out this Quercus acutidens thing, but I
Yeah.
guess I'm going to stop doing that here pretty soon.
Yeah, I can help you with that. I have some very strong opinions about that. So is there any information that would suggest that oaks are hybridizing at restoration sites if people are planting inappropriate species in restoration sites? Have you heard of that or at all?
Well, I haven't seen many specific examples. Most of the restoration sites I'm aware of that have oaks are largely like Quercus agrifolia, coast
Yeah.
live oak.
Yeah.
And I don't see, and I'm sure they do. It's just, these things are just crazy when it comes to being promiscuous. So if you put the
Yeah.
wrong oak in there, it will hybridize.
Yeah, they are very promiscuous. Why are there two varieties of agrifolia as opposed to just a cline?
Well, they don't really form a cline per se. They're actually relatively sharp. You find that within a relatively short area, it goes from trees that have the glabrous character to the fuzzy one. But that's true of many of these subspecies or varieties when you go north to south. If there's a change, it's kind of if someone thinks there's enough of a difference, but not everyone agrees on that all the time. That particular one, I don't think there's anybody who disagrees with it. Everything's pretty happy with it. So
Yeah. And they're just varieties anyway. They're not full species or anything like that. So it's fairly low taxonomic.
Although at one point they were considered separate species.
That's true.
But they just don't really overlap much. That's a good indicator that they're actually varieties.
What are the functions of the trichomes?
My guess would be that they're largely to limit the evaporation in the immediate leaf. The structure will actually break up wind and stuff quite a bit right there at the leaf base, because you don't want a whole lot of leaf exposure, because you get, in dry conditions, you just lose moisture a lot.
Yeah.
That's why you get a lot of fuzzy plants in the desert.
It's a question that I've seen many times. Do the black or red oaks hybridize locally with the white oaks?
No.
Correct. Yes.
No crop grouping. Oh, was that a question?
Yeah, well, I knew the answer to that, but I just wanted you to answer it. Another one that I think is pretty obvious, but so the acorns of all species are edible, correct?
That's probably true. I have not heard of any not being edible. I've heard that some are easier to eat than others because some of them have more tannins in it. You have to do a lot more soaking for some.
Yeah.
Like beta is actually supposed to be a pretty mild, easy oak to work with.
Okay. The let's see what we have. There was a comment that you made. I think there was just a misunderstanding about the oaks not being endemic to Mexico, but I think that was just misspoken. Certainly, there are many species of oaks that are endemic to Mexico.
No, I think that there was. I think the thing was, if you look at this, there's California stands has a pretty good. One of the has more endemics than many of the states. I think what I was saying for Mexico is, you look at the size of the states in Mexico, they're a little bit of a disadvantage because they're only a third to a quarter of the size, but they still often have about the same number of endemics, which tells you that if you had a bigger state, you get more endemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to watch me on that. I sometimes rattle things off and get the words all backwards. So
yeah. Do you know anything about the Engelmannii in redlands?
In redlands?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know the specifics, but it's pretty close to. It's not all that far east of where you find it in, the Pasadena area and Pomona and such. So it certainly could be some that gets that far east.
Yeah, I vaguely remember something about that. Somebody had commented if you had any specific information about that easternmost locality in redlands. So
I would first look at the consortium and see if AB had a collection of it and see what they said or when it was actually done. That was the first thing.
I don't know that
the
tree is still there. Yeah,
okay.
I don't know the tree is still there. So there was a lot of discussion about acutidens, a lot of people feeling that it was indeed a full species. I'm one of those. Do we have any overlay maps that show these beautiful maps that you have with all the species on one image?
I actually did have one in one image, but I just couldn't find it before I got the program put together.
Okay,
It's
so,
tricky because the problem is it's harder to work with that because some people have their definition of acutidens is SWIP, so you can find some of them going fairly far north. And the
yeah,
consortium also has the challenge where the algorithm does automatically dumps things into acutidens. So for example, a lobata by berberifolia hybrid becomes acutidens, but that's not how it works. So we're still kind of working it. Mostly you'll find it for sure in San Diego County. It gets up into Riverside County. The
mhm,
debate comes in how far to the northwest it's getting. Is it getting into Orange County? But it turns out some of the stuff we thought might be acutidens in Orange County probably is hybridizing berberifolia and Dorata gabrielensis, which was something I hadn't even thought about in 1995.
yeah,
And maybe get stuff up into everything, but that's probably the extent of where as far north we get. But if you want to treat acutidens as a full species, the question is, how do you separate it from some of the stuff in the rest of Southern California? And then maybe one of the definitions is that just the Southern California stuff from the Santa Monica Mountains south is all acutidens. The thing I don't like about that is that you can find oaks in Central California that aren't that easy to separate from the stuff in Southern California, and certainly within the stuff. So now you've got to think, okay, so is it really different than the northern stuff? And
right,
if it, that's, you would not use morphology. You'd have to use some sort of genetic test kit or something to tell it apart. That's not what I
Yeah.
like. In fact, Dylan Burge just said, forget it. It's just all berberifolia. It's just a client. It's got less hairs in the north and smaller leaves, and it's longer, bigger leaves and more hairs in the south, and that's it. So, that's why we're still working on that.
spoken like Dylan, spoken like a classic lumper, but that's neither here nor there. I love her. So the last question is, what is Grandida dentata then, those specimens in San Diego? Because I recognize what you're saying, that they never actually occurred here. They were in Monrovia and the hinterlands above Monrovia. So then what are these things that look like that down here?
Well, they're probably hybrids between either Cornus molari and berberifolia. You
Okay.
get the teeth from the scrub oak, and you get the size from the tree wall.
Yeah. Okay, let me see if there's any more late hit questions. So Kelloggi would be found in the Western Sierra foothills also?
Now, which one?
Kelloggi.
Oh, yeah, yes, I believe it's found in the Sierras also. But I think Garyana might replace it over part of that range. I'm trying to remember, what does it do? My map, it does my map on my slide. It looks like it did go into Ashby's.
Okay. All right, well, that's all the time we have for questions, I believe. We want to talk a little bit about our shop and the goodies that you can buy. So Joseph, if you could join us on the video here and talk about that, be great.
Thank you so much, Fred. And it was great to have you. And we typically have tables in the back of our meeting room with merchandise. And whenever Fred has spoken, quite often his spouse is back there with T-shirts that he's designed. And
have we done that in San Diego? I don't remember that. We did it once, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So I put the into the chat section
They actually found my website.
URL, yeah, and I just wanted to give you a little screenshot here. There's it's a good time to buy gifts, and now we can do this through the web. So you can go to Fred's site and check those all out, along with oak tree shirts. There's also monkey flower, Cleveland monkey flower, and Mariposa lilies, which is another a large subject matter that Fred studies. And the other thing I wanted to mention is maybe you want to, and have the space to, plant an oak. So we have on sale with the chapter right now. Oops, I got the wrong screen. pull that up again.
We have acorns, lots of acorns.
Yeah, and we have eight to 10 available. They should be on the site for another 4 or 5 weeks to, so that they're viable. And they're the steep price of $1.50 each, or 10, I think there's like 10 for 10. So you can go, I'll put that CA Native Seeds, and I'll put that into the chat. And again, thank you everyone for attending tonight and participating in the chat and the questions. Thank you, Vince, for hosting. And until our next presentation, which it appears that we're going to set something up with John Redman at the Natural History Museum. He is the curator of botany, and he'll be talking, I think, about the San Diego County Plant Atlas. We don't have a date yet, but it should be fairly soon. So I'll put that in the chat and leave it open for a couple minutes, and everyone have a good night.
Yeah, by the way, if anybody, don't look for oak shirts tonight. We've got new ones, but they're not in inventory yet. So it looks a little rifled over at the moment. I actually am working on a scrub oak t-shirt, so that should be in soon.
Excellent. And yes, this recording is being, this presentation has been and recorded and will be available to those of you that are arriving late. So fear not, you can watch this later and go over the questions and the dialogue in the chats as well. So thank you all so much for attending. And
Well, thanks for inviting me.
yep, our pleasure.
Okay. Now, so I'm leaving here.